In the heart of the Louisiana Bayou, surrounded by thick mist and dense trees, the Whitaker family carved out their isolated existence. Their plantation, located miles away from the nearest town, was a place of both awe and fear. For years, whispers about the Whitakers spread among the nearby communities. People spoke of their strange practices, how the family never seemed to age, their odd ritualistic gatherings, and the unsettling presence of candlelight flickering in the windows late into the night. Despite their fortune, they had little interaction with outsiders, preferring to keep their distance. Rumors swirled about dark dealings and inexplicable events, but no one dared approach the house for fear of what lay behind its crumbling walls. As time went on, the Whitakers' reclusiveness only deepened. They were rarely seen in town, and when they did appear, they seemed different, pale, withdrawn, as though they existed in a world entirely their own. The eldest Whitaker, Patriarch Everett Whitaker, was the subject of many conversations. Tall, gaunt, and with an air of cold authority, Everett rarely spoke to anyone, but his presence loomed over the town like a dark cloud. He and his family had amassed great wealth, yet they showed no interest in socializing or participating in the affairs of the local community. Instead, they spent their days shrouded in the thick fog of their own mysteries, leaving many to wonder if they were hiding a secret, one that no one had the courage to uncover. Locals began to speak of strange noises coming from the Whitaker mansion at night. Loud chants, the rhythmic sound of drums, and sometimes agonized screams. There were also tales of bizarre sightings near the bayou, figures moving silently through the fog, their eyes glowing in the dim light. As the years passed, the rumors became more disturbing, claiming that the Whitakers had some sort of dark power, one that kept them from aging, one that bound them to the bayou in ways that townsfolk couldn't understand. Yet whenever someone tried to approach the Whitaker estate, they would mysteriously vanish without a trace, leaving behind only an overwhelming sense of dread. The few who dared speak of the Whitakers began to link the family to the occult, believing that their rituals and practices had something to do with the unnatural happenings in the bayou. What was it that kept the Whitakers so secluded, and what secrets did they hide within their rotting walls? The tension between the Whitakers and the townspeople only grew as fear began to replace curiosity. Those who had once been brave enough to venture near the Whitaker estate now found themselves paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of terror. And yet, the Whitakers remained untouched by the passage of time, untouched by the growing fear that encircled them. The local law enforcement remained impotent against the mystery that surrounded the Whitaker clan. Despite several investigations, no one had ever dared enter their estate without consequence. The Whitakers, it seemed, were untouchable, an enigma wrapped in darkness. Soon, the legends of the family began to evolve into something far more sinister. Were they truly a family cursed by some ancient power, or were they simply mad, driven by something darker than anyone could imagine? This eerie legacy of the Whitakers would soon come to haunt the bayou in ways that no one could have foreseen. As the new century dawned, the Whitaker family's reputation, already steeped in mystery, began to spiral into something far darker. Frances Whitaker, the youngest daughter of the family, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. While some believed she had succumbed to a rare and unexplained illness, others whispered that foul play was involved. But the truth, as horrifying as it was, remained buried. The family's reaction was equally strange. No funeral, no mourning, just an eerie quiet that settled over the Whitaker estate. As the days turned into weeks, locals began to notice unusual activity at the mansion, particularly during the dead of night. One evening, a man from the nearby village, curious about the persistent rumors, decided to investigate. Under the cover of darkness, he crept closer to the Whitaker mansion, hoping to uncover the truth about the strange family. As he neared the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the dim light, lay Frances Whitaker's lifeless body, propped up on a wooden table. Surrounding her were the Whitaker family members, dressed in dark, ceremonial clothing, their eyes fixated on her in a way that sent a chill through the man's spine. What he witnessed that night was beyond his comprehension, acts that no sane person could ever imagine. The man's breath quickened as he watched in horror. The family, in what could only be described as a macabre ritual, engaged in actions that defied the boundaries of human decency. The scene was grotesque. There were no tears, no grief, only a disturbing and unnatural devotion to the deceased. The figure of Frances, once full of life, was now an object of strange reverence. The ritual seemed to be one of necrophilic nature, with the Whitakers crossing the line into depravity. What had once been a family of aristocratic repute was now revealed to be involved in practices that echoed the darkest corners of the human psyche. Shaken to his core, the man stumbled away from the scene, his mind struggling to process the horror he had just witnessed. The disturbing truth about the Whitakers was now undeniable. He returned to town, but when he tried to tell others what he had seen, they didn't believe him. The family was too powerful, their influence too far-reaching. Those who even dared question their actions were quickly dismissed as either mad or misinformed. But whispers continued to spread, slowly poisoning the minds of those who had once viewed the Whitakers as nothing more than an odd, reclusive family. The tale of Frances's death, coupled with the disturbing ritual, marked the beginning of a shift in how the community saw them. Despite the locals' reluctance to speak out, the tension in the town grew. People who had once been loyal to the Whitakers started to distance themselves, but no one dared to confront them directly. The rumor mill churned with talk of the Whitakers' unnatural relationship with the dead, and it became clear that they had crossed a line, one that should never have been crossed. The disturbing nature of their actions was like a stain on the community, one that no amount of silence could erase. But the Whitakers were untouchable, and the secrecy that had protected them for generations seemed to shield them from the consequences of their actions. As the rumors spread, a few brave souls attempted to uncover more about the Whitakers' strange rituals, but each time they were met with silence or disappearance. The mansion was shrouded in darkness, and those who ventured too close were often never seen again. The once thriving community around the Whitakers began to crumble under the weight of fear, and the Whitaker name became synonymous with unspeakable acts. The family had somehow managed to hide their sins for years, but now the true nature of their darkness was beginning to seep into the fabric of the town. The terrifying events surrounding Frances's death were just the beginning. As more people began to investigate, they uncovered a history of twisted rituals and necrophilic tendencies that had been hidden for generations. The Whitakers were not just eccentric, they were participants in a horrific, occult-like tradition that had been passed down through the family, one that involved the desecration of the dead. It seemed as though the family had become addicted to the power they believed came from their unholy actions, using necrophilia to retain control over life and death itself. What was once thought to be an eccentric family was revealed to be something far more sinister, something that should have never been allowed to grow unchecked. The more the community dug into the history of the Whitaker family, the more they realized that the boundaries of human decency had been crossed long ago. The Whitakers had constructed a world of their own, one where the dead were not allowed to rest, but instead were brought into their twisted rituals for the family's own gain. This new revelation set the stage for the dark path the Whitakers would continue down, one that would spiral into a legacy of horror that would haunt the Bayou for generations to come. By the turn of the century, the rumors surrounding the Whitakers grew more disturbing. Locals began whispering about gruesome events that occurred after the sudden death of a family member, Frances Whitaker. The details of her death were unclear. Some said she succumbed to a mysterious illness, others claimed foul play. What followed, however, became impossible to ignore. Late one evening, A local man ventured near the Whitaker home and witnessed what seemed to be a ritualistic gathering. Through the window, he saw what appeared to be Francis's body lying on a table, surrounded by family members. His heart raced as he witnessed what appeared to be a ritual of necrophilic nature, with the Whitakers engaging in acts that could only be described as twisted and grotesque. The man, paralyzed with fear, couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrifying scene unfolding before him. As the Whitaker family members circled Francis's body, their actions were disturbing in the most unnatural way. The ritual was not one of mourning, but rather one of reverence, a grotesque form of adoration for the deceased. The air was thick with incense and candle smoke, and the family appeared to be engaged in acts that defied the natural order of life and death. The figure of Francis, now lifeless, was used in ways that spoke to the Whitakers' unholy obsession with the dead. It was clear to the man that something sinister was at play, something that could not be ignored any longer. The man, overwhelmed by terror, managed to tear himself away from the window and stumbled back into the night, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. He could hardly believe what he had seen, but the images were burned into his mind, impossible to forget. The next morning he returned to town and tried to tell others what he had witnessed, but they wouldn't believe him. The Whitakers were a family feared and respected in equal measure, and no one dared question their behavior. Some locals dismissed his story as the ramblings of an overactive imagination, while others quietly acknowledged that the Whitakers had always been a strange family. But this was different. The man's warning went unheard. Despite the man's warnings, life continued as usual in the town. But the atmosphere was different. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and the whispers about the Whitakers' behavior grew more hushed and fearful. The unsettling rumors of necrophilia and dark rituals began to stir in the community, and the fear that had always lingered around the Whitaker family began to solidify into something more concrete. People became afraid to even speak their name. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong, like a curse had descended upon the town. Soon, people began to vanish. Neighbors and friends who had previously been seen visiting the Whitaker estate were now missing without a trace. No one spoke of it openly, but the community was now paralyzed by fear. The once quiet streets were filled with tension, and an unspoken dread hung over the town like a dark cloud. Everyone knew the Whitakers had something to do with the disappearances, but no one dared to investigate further. The more people tried to dig into the family's past, the more the Whitakers' power seemed to grow, like an invisible force that kept them above reproach. It wasn't long before those who had once been loyal to the Whitakers began to speak out. They, too, had witnessed strange occurrences, unnatural happenings, shadowy figures moving in and out of the estate, and a pervasive sense of evil that seemed to cling to everything around them. The once mythical family, whose eccentricities were once written off as harmless, were now revealed to be participants in a far more sinister and violent legacy. What had been dismissed as folklore was becoming a terrifying reality, one that no one in the community could ignore any longer. With the weight of the truth now heavy in the air, the town began to unravel. More people came forward with stories of witnessing unexplainable things near the Whitaker mansion, strange lights in the night, and the unmistakable scent of incense. It became clear that whatever had taken root in that house was beyond human understanding. The Whitakers' dark rituals had grown from whispers into a terrifying certainty, and though many tried to flee, it seemed as though the Whitaker family was always one step ahead, casting a dark shadow over the town that would never lift. The revelation of the Whitaker family's necrophilic rituals shocked the community to its core, but it also confirmed something darker. The Whitakers were not just eccentric, they were evil, and their rituals were a twisted part of their existence. The legend of their disturbing practices continued to grow, with each new tale adding another layer to the horror. The town, now gripped by fear, could no longer ignore the darkness that had taken root in their midst, nor could they escape the grip of the Whitaker family's power, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the growing fear that gripped the town. A small group of investigators set out to uncover the truth behind the Whitaker family. Among them were a local sheriff, a few trusted townsfolk, and an outsider with knowledge of occult practices. The group had heard the stories, but they could no longer ignore the mounting rumors. They felt it was their duty to confront the Whitakers and expose whatever dark secrets they were hiding. Armed with only their courage and an unyielding determination, they ventured into the bayou, unaware of the horrors they would soon encounter. The air grew thick with tension as they approached the edge of the swamp, the oppressive silence unsettling. As they made their way through the dense underbrush, they noticed strange symbols carved into the trees and etched into stones scattered around the area. The markings were not like anything any of them had ever seen before. Some resembled arcane symbols, others were geometric patterns, and some were completely unrecognizable. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a world they didn't understand, one that felt older and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The further they walked, the heavier the air became, and an unease began to settle over the group. It was as if the bayou itself was alive with malevolent energy, reacting to their intrusion. The deeper they ventured into the swamp, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The thick fog that clung to the ground seemed to follow them, wrapping around their ankles like a cold hand. The once familiar sounds of the swamp, the chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, fell eerily silent. A chilling, unnatural quiet filled the air, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared speak. Each of them felt the weight of a presence watching them, though they saw nothing. It was as if the very land itself was alive, aware of their every move. As they approached the Whitaker mansion, the symbols on the trees grew more frequent, and the air grew heavier with the stench of decay. The once imposing structure stood in eerie silence, its windows blackened and uninviting. There was no sign of movement, no welcoming lights. The mansion seemed to stand as a monument to something darker than they had ever imagined. The sheriff, a hardened man who had seen his share of danger, could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and his instincts screamed at him to turn back. But the group pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. As they circled the perimeter of the mansion, they began to notice more disturbing signs: broken fences, overgrown weeds, and the lingering smell of rot that clung to the air. One of the townsfolk, a man named Charles, was the first to notice a hidden path leading into the woods behind the house. It was barely visible, overgrown with vines and thorns, as if it had not been used in years. But Charles felt drawn to it, as though the path was calling to him. The others hesitated, but after a brief exchange of glances, they followed him. The closer they got to the trail, the more they felt as if they were being guided into a trap. Yet, they continued. As they followed the narrow, winding path, the oppressive feeling only grew. The fog thickened, and the shadows seemed to dance in the corners of their vision. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves felt as if something or someone was stalking them. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. It was as if they were no longer just in the bayou, but within a realm where the rules of nature no longer applied. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized they were walking into the heart of the Whitaker family's secrets. The path seemed to stretch on forever, leading them to a hidden clearing where the trees formed a circle, almost like an altar. In the center of the clearing, the investigators found a series of strange, weathered stones arranged in a circle. The symbols etched into the stones matched those they had seen in the trees. The ground beneath their feet felt unnaturally cold, and the air buzzed with an eerie, electric energy. As they examined the stones, they found what appeared to be fresh marks, footprints leading deeper into the woods. It was clear now that the Whitakers were not just a family of recluses. They were deeply involved in something far more sinister, something that could not be explained by reason alone. With their hearts pounding and fear creeping up their spines, the group realized they had uncovered something far darker than they had ever expected. As they stood in the clearing, staring at the ominous symbols and the unsettling atmosphere that surrounded them, they knew they had only scratched the surface of the Whitaker family's dark legacy. The truth was more horrific than they could have imagined, and it was only a matter of time before they would learn just how far the Whitakers were willing to go to protect their secrets. As the investigation continued, the investigators stumbled upon a dusty old chest hidden deep within the Whitaker estate. Covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, the chest had been locked away for what seemed like an eternity. After breaking the lock, they were greeted with a grim sight, a collection of weathered papers, yellowed with age, bound together in leather. The documents, which they could only describe as dark family files, contained records that chilled them to the bone. These files, written in a mixture of cryptic symbols and archaic language, chronicled the Whitaker family's sinister rituals, tracing their origins back for generations. The sheer scope of what they had uncovered was enough to shake them to their core. Inside the chest were not just records of necrophilic rituals, but detailed accounts of sacrifices and unspeakable acts performed by the Whitakers over the years. The documents were meticulous, almost obsessively so, revealing that these rituals were not born from superstition, but rather a deeply ingrained family tradition. It seemed that the Whitakers had been engaging in these dark practices for centuries, performing rituals that involved the dead in ways that defied all moral boundaries. The most disturbing part of these documents was a chilling passage that detailed how these rituals were believed to grant the Whitakers immortality, or at least a twisted form of eternal life. The ritualistic acts outlined in the files described the Whitakers' belief that by possessing the bodies of the deceased, they could retain their youth, strength, and vitality. The process was grotesque and disturbing, involving the physical manipulation of the dead in ways that made even the most hardened investigator recoil in horror. The documents detailed a specific method passed down through the generations to ensure that the soul of the deceased remained tethered to their body, enabling the Whitakers to perform their vile acts without fear of retribution. The files also made mention of the Dark Mark, a symbol that the Whitakers believed would protect them from the forces of death, allowing them to live for an indefinite period. Among the files was a particularly disturbing account of the death of Francis Whitaker. The document revealed that Francis's death had not been an accident, nor the result of an illness as the town believed. Instead, it was part of a larger plan, the culmination of a ritual in which she had willingly participated, offering herself as a sacrifice to the family's dark ritual. What was most horrifying was the revelation that Francis's body had been preserved, used in the very same ritual that the Whitakers had engaged in for generations. The family's involvement in necrophilia was not a recent development, but a deeply ingrained practice that had sustained their bloodline for decades. The deeper the investigators dug into the files, the more the true nature of the Whitaker family's malevolent practices became clear. The rituals were not just acts of depravity, they were viewed as necessary steps in maintaining the Whitakers' position of power. The family believed that through these unholy rites, they could summon dark forces that would protect them from illness, aging, and even death. The investigators also found references to an ancient pact, believed to have been made by the Whitaker patriarch many years ago, with an otherworldly entity, one that promised to grant the family immortality in exchange for their loyalty and blood. The disturbing truth revealed in the files left the investigators reeling. It was clear that the Whitakers were not merely eccentric, as many had believed. They were practitioners of dark, necrophilic rituals driven by an insatiable hunger for eternal life. What was even more chilling was the realization that Frances Whitaker was not the first victim of these grotesque acts, and certainly she wouldn't be the last. The files suggested that there were more victims, both known and unknown, and that the Whitaker family had continued their unholy practices, seemingly without remorse or hesitation. The town's worst fears were confirmed. The Whitakers were monsters in human form. As the investigators pieced together the evidence, they realized that the Whitakers' connection to the dead was not merely ceremonial. It was an ongoing cycle that involved the victimization of the living, turning them into vessels for the Whitakers' dark desires. The rituals had become an integral part of the family's identity, and the files made it clear that they would stop at nothing to preserve their twisted legacy. The horror of what they had uncovered became all too real. The Whitaker family's reign of terror was not a thing of the past. It was an ever-present threat that continued to haunt the land. The revelation of these horrifying truths left the investigators with a terrible choice: expose the Whitaker family's dark legacy and risk their own lives in the process, or remain silent and allow the horrors to continue. The files, now in their possession, held the key to unraveling the Whitakers' twisted history, but it was clear that digging too deep into the past could have deadly consequences. The Whitakers had already killed to protect their secrets, and they would not hesitate to do so again. As the investigation unfolded, the chilling truth behind the Whitaker family's dark rituals began to surface. The investigators, having dug through generations of family records, uncovered something far more horrifying than they had anticipated: an ancient and unholy pact. According to the documents, the Whitakers had forged a deal with a malevolent, otherworldly entity many generations ago. This pact, sealed in blood, promised them immortality in exchange for the ritualistic sacrifice of their dead. The family had pledged to offer their deceased to this entity, with the belief that through these sacrifices they could retain their youth, power, and unrelenting vitality. The disturbing truth revealed that their twisted necrophilic acts were not mere perversions, but a necessary ritual to maintain their immortality. The pact was not a simple exchange. It was a binding contract, one that tied every Whitaker descendant to the entity for eternity. Once a Whitaker became a part of the family's dark tradition, they were irrevocably bound to the entity, their souls enslaved in an endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The rituals, horrifying as they were a constant necessity to ensure the family's continued power and life force. The curse, which began as a desire for eternal life, had grown into a nightmare from which no Whitaker could escape. The pact, it seemed, had been made not just for longevity, but for dominion over life and death itself. In exchange for their undying existence, the Whitakers were condemned to a twisted existence that turned them into predators of the dead. With each passing generation, the curse deepened, solidifying the Whitakers' connection to the malevolent force. The rituals were no longer seen as mere superstition. They were the lifeblood of the family, the key to their power. The family's immortality, which they had long taken for granted, was in fact a prison, a perpetual cycle that trapped their souls in a world where death could never be fully escaped. The family's need to continue the rituals was so great that they had become more twisted and depraved over time, each generation sinking deeper into the abyss of necrophilic practices and sacrificial rites. The Whitakers had not only sacrificed their dead, but in the process had sacrificed their very humanity. The investigators were horrified by the implications of what they had uncovered. It became clear that the Whitakers' immortality came at an unspeakable cost. They were not just living forever, they were existing in a corrupted form, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Their souls were condemned to an eternal rebirth, trapped in the cycle of their own making. What the Whitakers had failed to understand, however, was that their immortality was not a gift, it was a curse. And the price they had paid to the malevolent entity had bound them to a fate worse than death itself. Each ritual, each act of necrophilia, each sacrificial offering only strengthened the grip of the entity that controlled them. The investigation into the Whitaker family's dark past revealed the horrifying extent of their pact. It was clear that the family was trapped in a nightmare that spanned generations. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the Whitakers were not just perpetrators of evil. They were victims of a curse that had been passed down through the centuries. This curse, bound by the ancient pact, had infected every aspect of their lives, and no matter what they did, there was no escape. The more the investigators learned, the more they felt the oppressive weight of the Whitakers' curse closing in on them. The Whitakers were not just a family, they were prisoners, shackled by a pact that had given them immortality at the cost of their souls. As the investigators delved deeper into the family's history, they began to understand the full scope of the horror the Whitakers had brought upon themselves. The rituals had been designed to keep them young and powerful, but they had also bound them to the entity that had granted them their immortality. Over time, the entity's influence had grown, and it was clear that it was using the Whitakers as pawns in a far larger and more sinister game. The Whitakers had willingly become agents of darkness, trading their souls for the illusion of eternal life. But with each sacrifice, they had given more of themselves to the entity until they were no longer human. They were mere vessels, existing only to fulfill the will of the dark force that controlled them. In the end, the true cost of immortality was revealed. The Whitakers had not gained eternal life. They had become slaves to a malevolent force, their lives bound by an ancient pact that could never be broken. Every act of necrophilia, every sacrifice, every twisted ritual was another chain in their eternal prison. And as the investigators pieced together the truth, they realized that the Whitakers' curse had never been just about immortality. It had always been about the gradual erosion of their humanity. They had traded everything for power, and in the end, they had lost it all. The revelation of the Whitakers' cursed existence left the investigators with a chilling understanding. Immortality had come at the cost of everything that made the Whitakers human. They were no longer a family. They were vessels, bound by an ancient pact, forever trapped in an endless cycle of life and death. The malevolent entity that controlled them had won, and the Whitakers were its eternal servants. The horror of the pact was not just in the rituals they performed, but in the knowledge that they would never escape. Their souls were lost, condemned to a twisted fate from which there was no return. As the years passed after the investigation into the Whitaker family's cursed legacy, unsettling reports began to spread across the town. Locals whispered of figures appearing from the bayou at night, eerily silent, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. These were not the peaceful spirits of the departed. They were the victims of the Whitaker family's necrophilic rituals, those who had been sacrificed in twisted rites to sustain the family's cursed immortality. Rather than finding rest, these souls were bound to the bayou, their bodies corrupted by the dark forces the Whitakers had long worshipped. They moved like hollow shells, their once human features now twisted and grotesque, seeking only vengeance. With each passing night, the sightings became more frequent. People spoke of figures emerging from the swamps, aimlessly wandering toward the Whitaker estate. They were drawn to the house as if bound by some invisible force that connected them to their tormentors. But it wasn't just the family who saw these walking horrors. The townsfolk were also witnesses to the growing nightmare. At first, it seemed like mere superstition or the products of fevered minds. But soon, the dead began to make their presence known. The once thriving town now found itself on edge, its people gripped by fear. The Whitaker curse had never truly ended. It had only evolved into something far more terrifying. The Whitakers themselves were oblivious to the horrors that had begun to haunt them. As the undead victims appeared at their doorstep, drawn by the evil that had once been their own, they began to feel a strange pull toward the bayou. The whispers of the dead seemed to be calling them. Those who had once been part of the Whitaker clan's dark rituals found themselves inexplicably drawn to the house where it all began. It was as though the curse had taken on a new form, one that could no longer be contained by the boundaries of death. The undead were no longer simply victims, they had become instruments of retribution, forever trapped in a cycle of torment and revenge. Each night the dead grew bolder, inching closer to the Whitaker estate. The haunting figures appeared in greater numbers, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of suffering and rage. Some appeared to be former members of the Whitaker family, their features contorted by the horrors they had endured. Others were victims from the town, innocent lives claimed by the family's dark rituals. These vengeful spirits, now bound by the curse, had no mercy. They roamed the land, seeking justice for the wrongs that had been done to them, for the lives that had been stolen and desecrated. The town became a place of fear and paranoia. People began to avoid the Bayou, and the Whitaker estate, once an imposing landmark, now became a symbol of terror. No one dared venture near the cursed grounds, and those who lived close to the estate reported hearing eerie sounds at night, whispers, cries, and the unsettling feeling that they were being watched by eyes that could never blink. The dead had returned, and they were not content to simply haunt the living. They wanted vengeance, and the Whitakers had no way of stopping them. The investigators, long since disbanded, had warned that the Whitaker sins would have consequences far beyond their mortal lives. Now, those warnings were coming true. As the undead walked the earth, the town began to realize that the Whitaker curse was not something that could simply be forgotten or buried. It was a force that transcended death itself, and it would not rest until it had claimed every soul associated with the family's dark history. The horror had become unstoppable, and the town found itself at the mercy of vengeful spirits, each one a reminder of the horrific price paid for immortality. For the Whitakers, there was no escape. The undead victims, once trapped by the pact made so long ago, were now free to exact their revenge, and in their quest for justice, they were coming for those who had inflicted the suffering upon them. One by one, the Whitakers began to realize that their immortality came at an even greater cost than they had ever anticipated. The price was not just their humanity, but the souls of all those who had ever been tied to them. Now, those souls had returned, and they were coming for the family that had condemned them to an eternity of torment. As the Whitaker family faced the horrors of their past, they were forced to confront the true nature of their curse. The dead had risen, and they would not rest until they had claimed their vengeance. The Bayou, once a place of refuge for the family, had become the site of their downfall. The living and the dead were now locked in a deadly dance, each side bound by the horrors of the past. The Whitakers could not escape the consequences of their actions, and the vengeance of the undead would haunt them until the end of time. The Whitaker family, once powerful and feared, began to unravel as the spirits of the dead grew stronger. Their efforts to break the cycle of torment were futile, as the vengeful souls of their victims seemed to be everywhere. The air around their once majestic mansion grew heavy with an oppressive sense of doom. Each passing day brought more supernatural occurrences, faint whispers in the wind, shadows moving unnaturally, and the smell of decay permeating the air. The once invincible family was now trapped in a nightmare of their own making, and the spirits, no longer bound by the Whitakers' control, were rising with a vengeance. As the undead figures began to appear more frequently, the Whitakers became increasingly paranoid. They heard the sounds of footsteps echoing through the house at night, saw faces pressed against the windows, and felt the cold breath of the deceased on their necks. Their mansion, once a symbol of their dominance, now felt like a prison. Each room seemed to hold the echoes of the past, cries for mercy, the sound of chains dragging across the floor, and the distant haunting moans of the spirits seeking revenge. The family tried to barricade themselves inside, but no matter what they did, the spirits always found a way in. The once proud patriarch of the Whitaker family, now an old man, could no longer protect his kin from the wrath of the undead. His once strong will was shattered, and he could do nothing but watch as the spirits closed in on his remaining family members. The mansion, once a place of power and wealth, had become a tomb. The Whitakers were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. Each night, the spirits grew bolder, their attacks more frequent. The Whitakers were being picked off one by one, their cries for help echoing through the house, but no one was left to answer. In a final, desperate attempt to save themselves, the last remaining Whitakers tried to flee the mansion, but the spirits were relentless. They had been bound to the bayou for so long that nothing, not even death, could free them. The Whitakers' bloodline, cursed by their ancestors' pact, had come to an end. The last of the family was dragged back into the house, their souls forever bound to the land they had defiled. The mansion, once filled with wealth and luxury, was now a place of death and despair, its walls echoing with the cries of the damned. The bayou, once a place of beauty, had become a graveyard of twisted souls, each one yearning for vengeance. The Whitakers had made a pact with a dark force, and now their immortality had turned into an eternal nightmare. The spirits they had once controlled were now their executioners. The Whitakers were no longer feared, they were pitied, their legacy reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Their mansion stood as a decaying monument to their sins, abandoned by the living and claimed by the dead. The bayou had become their final resting place, a place where the past could never be forgotten. As the last remnants of the Whitaker family were consumed by the darkness, the spirits turned their attention to the rest of the town. The curse had not ended with the family's demise, it had only just begun. The town that had once lived in fear of the Whitakers now became the next target of the spirits' wrath. No one was safe. As the town descended into chaos, the legend of the Whitaker family continued to haunt the land. The bayou remained cursed, a place where death and suffering would forever reign. No matter how hard the townsfolk tried to escape, the spirits were always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next victim to fall. The bayou, with its twisted trees and dark waters, had become a place of fear and death. The Whitakers had brought this curse upon themselves, but it was not just their fate that had been sealed, it was the fate of everyone who came too close. The spirits of the undead still roamed the bayou, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to enter their domain. The once proud Whitaker name was nothing but a shadow, a reminder of the darkness that had once controlled the land. But even in their destruction, the Whitakers had not been forgotten. Their legacy lived on in the spirits that haunted the bayou, forever cursed and bound to the land they had once called home. The town, now abandoned, was left in ruins. The Whitakers' mansion, the center of their power, stood as a rotting shell of its former self. No one dared to approach it, and those who did never returned. The town's dark past had come to an end, but the Whitaker curse remained. It would not be easily forgotten. Even as the last of the family was consumed by the darkness, the whispers of their cursed legacy lived on in the wind, carried by the spirits of the bayou. And so, the cycle of death and torment continued, with no hope of escape. The cursed land of the Whitakers remains a place of dread, with the dark legacy of the family still lingering in the thick fog of the bayou. Years after their destruction, whispers of their twisted practices still echo through the trees. Those brave or foolish enough to approach the decaying mansion are never seen again, swallowed by the swamp as if the earth itself conspires to hide their fate. The spirits of the dead, forever bound to the land, continue to roam the ruins, seeking new souls to claim. The bayou, once a peaceful haven, has now become an inescapable tomb for those who dare trespass. As the night falls over the swamp, the wind carries with it the faint, chilling sounds of the dead calling out for retribution. The spirits that once were human have become something far more sinister, unstoppable, vengeful forces that prey on the living. Those who have ventured too close to the mansion tell of strange lights flickering from the windows, the sounds of footsteps trailing behind them, and shadows that move in ways that no living thing could. The curse of the Whitakers is alive, and it remains an unbroken chain, stretching into eternity, bound by the pact that was made so long ago. Locals who live near the bayou speak of a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that never seems to leave. Some claim that, on particularly dark nights, you can hear the whispers of the Whitakers calling to the living from the depths of the swamp. There are stories of people who felt an unnatural pull to the ruins, as if some unseen force was beckoning them to come closer. Those who were brave enough to venture into the bayou in search of answers never returned. It is said that their bodies were never found, as if the land itself consumed them, hiding their remains deep within the murky waters. The cursed remains of the Whitaker mansion are still visible to those who know where to look, standing as a decaying monument to the family's wickedness. Its walls have crumbled, but the shadows of the past still cling to its structure. The land around it remains poisoned, the soil tainted by the rituals and sacrifices that were carried out for centuries. Though the family is gone, their malevolent influence lingers, making the bayou a place where death is never truly far away. The cursed land waits, patient and still, for its next victim to stumble into its grasp. Over time, the legend of the Whitaker family has transformed into a ghost story told to scare children and outsiders. But for those who live near the bayou, the fear is very real. The legacy of the Whitakers is not a story to be dismissed lightly. The land itself holds the remnants of their evil, and the spirits of the dead continue their endless march. The curse lives on, a constant presence hidden in the fog of the swamps, forever binding the past to the present. The Whitaker name may have been erased, but the terror they wrought never truly ends. And so, the bayou remains cursed, its secrets buried deep in the shadows of the trees. The spirits of the Whitaker clan continue to roam, their vengeance unrelenting as the curse persists through the ages. It is said that as long as the bayou exists, the Whitakers will never be gone. Their legacy, dark and twisted, will live on, awaiting the next soul foolish enough to seek the answers buried in the heart of the swamp.